Britain didn't just face a setback, it walked straight into a $100 billion humiliation that unfolded on live television. In just 48 hours, global markets recoiled, allies distanced themselves, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi delivered a blow no British leader imagined possible. One sentence, calm, sharp, and final, shattered the illusion of post-Brexit strength and exposed the chaos running Westminster. What happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a diplomatic accident. It was a calculated retaliatory strike triggered by arrogance, secrecy, and a government that believed India would never dare to fight back. They were wrong. Very wrong. Before we get in, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. This story is moving fast, governments are panicking, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Britain's collapse didn't arrive slowly. It detonated. One moment, markets were steady, trade screens flickering in their usual rhythm, and the next, absolute freefall. In just 48 hours, nearly $100 billion evaporated from the UK economy. Investors didn't walk, they sprinted. Billions were pulled from London exchanges before analysts even understood what triggered the stampede. British cargo ships were suddenly held in Indian ports, shipments rerouted, contracts frozen mid-route. What began as a diplomatic dispute instantly morphed into a full-scale economic shockwave. Factories across Birmingham and Manchester reported immediate delays. Suppliers refused to release goods without guarantees. Transport companies suspended deliveries. Traders watched helplessly as the pound plunged and global markets recalculated Britain's risk profile in real time. Inside financial war rooms, red alerts flooded screens. By the second day, intelligence briefings labeled the situation unprecedented exposure, a level of vulnerability not seen since the 2008 crash. Governments in Washington, Canberra, and Ottawa were briefed that Britain had effectively walked blindfolded into an economic ambush. And the question echoed everywhere, from newsrooms to trading floors to Downing Street itself. How did a government that promised stability, competence, and renewed global partnerships manage to trigger the fastest financial meltdown in modern UK history? No one had answers. But everyone knew where the fallout was heading next. Just weeks before the blow-up, the atmosphere in London couldn't have been more different. Downing Street was preparing for a moment of triumph. Staff rehearsed statements, photographers were booked, and champagne chilled quietly behind closed doors. The India-UK trade agreement wasn't just another deal. It was the centerpiece of Britain's post-Brexit survival strategy. A grand announcement meant to show the world that the UK still had reach, influence, and economic muscle. For Starmer's administration, it was supposed to be the headline proving Brexit hadn't crippled British diplomacy. In New Delhi, Modi's team approached the negotiations with cautious optimism. India was ready for a partnership, mutual, respectful, productive. They saw opportunity, but they were also alert. The talks had been long, complex, and delicate, but everything appeared aligned. The terms were balanced, the projections were strong, both sides were prepared to sign. Or so India thought. Because while the lights in Downing Street glowed with anticipation, a quiet shift was already happening deep within the bureaucratic machinery. Sections of the agreement were quietly rewritten. Clauses were restructured. Restrictions were added. A deal that once looked balanced now tilted sharply, almost surgically, in Britain's favor. Modi's advisors hadn't yet seen the trap, but it was already there, buried in the fine print, waiting to detonate. And when they finally uncovered it, the illusion of partnership would shatter forever. The betrayal didn't come through open disagreement or tough negotiation. It came quietly, buried deep inside the final draft, executed by people who assumed India would never notice. When Modi's legal and economic advisors examined the revised agreement, they found clauses that hadn't been discussed in a single negotiating session. Hidden tariffs disguised as regulatory adjustments. Import restrictions labeled as safeguard measures. Control mechanisms that handed Britain unilateral authority to pause key sections of the deal without consulting India. This wasn't a tweak, this was a trap. Leaked documents later revealed how these changes were inserted. Late-night revisions, unsigned notes, and anonymous directives passed through internal channels in London. The edits were deliberate, strategic, and designed to tilt the entire agreement in Britain's favor while giving India virtually nothing in return. When the Indian Trade Office received the altered text, the initial reaction was disbelief. Senior advisors assumed it was a mistake, an early draft sent accidentally. But as they cross-checked the pages, the realization hit. Nothing here was accidental. Someone in Starmer's government had tried to outmaneuver India in the shadows. The moment everything changed didn't come from a press conference or a policy paper. It came from one smug, careless message that should never have reached Indian intelligence, but did within hours. A senior British official, reacting to India's demand for clarification, sent a private note across Whitehall. "Modi will never walk away. They need us more than we need them." Those 13 words detonated louder than any sanction or tariff ever could. To Indian officials, it was a flashback to an era they believed was buried, a colonial arrogance stripped bare, revealing exactly how Britain still viewed the relationship. Not as equals, not as partners, but as a nation that could be pressured, cornered, and managed. When the intelligence report landed on the desks of Modi's top security and diplomatic advisors, outrage spread instantly. Phones lit up across ministries. Screenshots circulated through encrypted channels. Analysts labeled it a direct insult to national dignity. Diplomats called it the most reckless statement from a British official in decades. Within hours, the message reached Modi himself. Witnesses later described him as calm, silent, taking in the words with a clarity that unnerved everyone in the room. Because he wasn't preparing a complaint. He was preparing a response, public, deliberate, and impossible for Britain to ignore. And once he delivered it, nothing between the two nations would ever be the same again. When Modi stepped onto the stage in New Delhi, there was no dramatic music, no raised voice, no theatrics, just a leader who had reached his limit. Cameras clicked, lights flashed, and yet his presence cut through the room with an unsettling calm. He delivered his statement slowly, clearly, every word sharpened like steel. India will not accept disrespect disguised as partnership. No anger, no negotiation, just a final line drawn across decades of diplomacy. Then, without taking a single question, he turned and walked off. Inside the Indian parliament, the reaction was immediate. Members stood, applauded, some visibly emotional. It wasn't just support, it was pride, a nation watching its leader refuse to bow. Within minutes, the clips surged across social media, trending in 47 countries. Hashtags like #StarmerBetrays India and #India stands tall dominated global timelines. International headlines followed. Analysts in Washington called it a seismic diplomatic moment. Australian and Canadian officials issued cautious statements, signaling panic beneath the politeness. Even the US State Department urged both sides to exercise restraint, a diplomatic translation of, "London, you just made a monumental mistake." Modi's strike wasn't explosive because he shouted. It was explosive because he didn't need to. And the world watched Britain brace for impact. If Modi's statement was a calculated precision strike, Starmer's response was the detonation that turned a diplomatic dispute into a full-blown global crisis. Standing before reporters, instead of apologizing or clarifying, he smirked and brushed off India's outrage as political theater. A comment delivered in seconds, but one that would haunt Britain for decades. The reaction behind the scenes was instant and brutal. Senior diplomats described the remark as catastrophically tone-deaf. Former ambassadors privately warned that Starmer had just insulted the world's largest democracy on live television. Even labor insiders were stunned. One aide later admitted it felt like watching a plane nosedive while the pilot laughed. India moved within hours, not days, hours. Trade talks were fully suspended, not paused. Ports across Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata began holding British shipments. Containers were stacked, sealed, and marked for indefinite review. Back in Britain, the shock hit real people first. Factories in Birmingham and Manchester had contracts cancelled overnight. Pharmaceutical shipments were blocked. Tech components never arrived. Small businesses that depended on Indian imports or exports suddenly faced collapse. Starmer thought he could downplay Modi's warning. Instead, he accelerated the crisis into something no government could control. The meltdown had officially gone nuclear. The first leak didn't seem catastrophic. A stray meeting log, a timestamp, a donor's name quietly highlighted. But within hours, investigative teams began connecting the threads, and the picture that emerged was darker than simple political miscalculation. The documents revealed a pattern. Private dinners between senior labor advisors and a cluster of donors tied to industries threatened by rising Asian trade power. Then came the bank records, carefully routed payments through consultancy fronts, foundations, and think tanks whose only real output was influence. What raised eyebrows in intelligence circles was not just the money, but the language in the internal strategy papers. Phrases like "manage India's ascent," "slow expectations through calibrated diplomacy," and "avoid explicit fingerprints" read less like government planning and more like covert containment ops. As journalists dug deeper, one conclusion gained traction: this wasn't incompetence. It looked engineered. A foreign-aligned network operating through donations, lobbyists, and policy funnels may have nudged Starmer toward a disastrous stance that served their interests, not Britain's. The geopolitical implications were staggering. If true, it meant Britain's India crisis wasn't an accident. It was a targeted disruption at the exact moment when Asia's influence was accelerating globally. And the biggest question loomed: who else was involved? The backlash didn't arrive gradually. It detonated. Within hours of Starmer's dismissal of Modi, Australia issued a carefully worded statement urging responsible rhetoric between Commonwealth partners, which diplomats immediately recognized as a polite slap. Canada followed with a colder warning about fracturing shared frameworks. The United States delivered the harshest code of all, urging the UK to stabilize bilateral trust immediately, a phrase historically reserved for governments on the brink of diplomatic isolation. Meanwhile, global media ran with a single theme: Britain had ignited a crisis it could not contain. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was reportedly incandescent. Sources close to the royal household claimed King Charles was deeply disturbed that decades of Commonwealth unity had been jeopardized overnight. The monarchy had always played the long game: relationship building, quiet diplomacy, and Starmer's blunder threatened that legacy in one blow. Inside Downing Street, paranoia took hold. Encrypted files vanished from shared drives. Staffers whispered about personal devices being seized, and a stream of panicked calls flowed between ministers trying to work out how much of the crisis was reversible. Journalists began comparing the moment to Suez, not just a diplomatic failure, but a global humiliation. By the end of the week, Britain's image had collapsed from respected mediator to reckless agitator, and the world was recalibrating accordingly. India didn't wait. Within 36 hours, New Delhi announced the broadest retaliation ever levied against a Western partner, sweeping tariffs on UK automotive parts. Pharmaceutical imports slowed to a crawl, and a sudden export ban on critical chemicals used in British manufacturing. Visas for UK business travelers were suspended indefinitely, and Indian ports began diverting British cargo to secondary inspection queues that stretched for days. It was a masterclass in economic pressure: precise, devastating, and fully legal. Markets reacted instantly. The pound plunged in overnight trading, luxury fashion houses listed on the ITSE saw billions wiped out, and British exporters watched supply routes choke as insurers raised risk premiums. Inside the Labour Party, chaos erupted. Cabinet meetings devolved into shouting matches, advisors threatened to resign live on air, and polling collapsed in a way not seen since the post-Iraq backlash. Meanwhile, in India, Modi's approval surged to levels usually reserved for wartime leaders. Even opposition figures praised his measured strength. The contrast was brutal. India stood unified, confident, ascendant. Britain looked fractured, panicked, and cornered. And the world was watching which nation understood power and which one had just learned the cost of misreading it. Inside number 10, Starmer faced a choice that would define his legacy: fight the storm and risk dismantling his own government, or accept responsibility and step aside before the investigation swallowed the entire Labour leadership. And this is where the story leaves the audience with the unavoidable question: was this sabotage or staggering incompetence? If you're watching, reading, or listening, don't miss the next chapter. Like, share, and subscribe for the full breakdown.